Scott, our partner, indicated, I'm a corporate partner in Salt Lake, and I've practiced in our market for a long time, 28, 29 years. I can't do the math very well. And have done all sorts of transactions with lots of different kinds of companies, including life science companies. Those transactions have involved a lot of efforts to raise money from varieties of ways. And like Scott said, I do a lot of M&A as well, but helping companies raise money has been a big part of my career. And I'm gonna let now Liz talk about a little bit more of her history, because she's a lawyer and she'll talk about that, but she has she's just not worked at a law firm her whole life. So I'll let her talk about her experience, and it'll add a lot of fun and relevance to what we're talking about here today.
Thanks for that introduction. As Sam mentioned, I have not always worked at a law firm. I left law school, went to private practice, and from there I spent the last 11 years at the SEC, most recently as the acting office chief of the Office of Small Business Policy, which is responsible for kind of all of the fun stuff we're going to talk about here today in terms of private company capital raising and capital raising under the exemptions from registration, which means capital raising by a private company outside of an IPO. So I joined Mayer Brown in January, so that experience is fairly recent, and that's one of the reasons that I'm here today to talk to you. So in my most recent role at the SEC as the acting chief of the Office of Small Business Policy, we were responsible for dealing with all of the private company forms and questions and all the things that came in. We actually have a tip line that you can call, and when the government is in session, which hopefully it will be soon, a real person will actually call you back and will answer your specific private company capital raising questions. So just a little plug for that resource if anyone is interested and runs into a snag or just has a question about how any of these exemptions work kind of in your facts and circumstances. They can't give legal advice, but they are a really good resource, and a real person does answer the phone, which is always nice at a government agency. They're there to help, and the reality is that the SEC is extremely, extremely interested in private company capital raising right now. You may have heard, kind of if you're plugged into any of the blogs or press or anything about the SEC, this phrase that people keep throwing around, which is the SEC is open for business. And they truly mean that. The private company capital markets are booming, and they want to figure out ways to allow more companies to access that capital and to access it at different stages in their life cycle. And so that is something that is extremely important to this administration, and we're going to talk a little bit later about some steps that they are already taking, and we think they will continue to take in that vein. But stepping into our content today.
Well, before you do that, I'm going to bug you with a question. So,
Sure.
Having worked with companies for years, generally the view companies that I've worked with have had about the SEC is something to consider in deep fear and trembling, and to be afraid of, and to make sure we somehow avoid any connection with, and to not get investigated by or not get sued by, and all that fun stuff. So I know you just said it, but maybe you could just amplify briefly on the fact that what we're going to talk about today is all the ways the SEC really actually wants you to succeed in raising money. Just in your own mindset and what you did in your role when you thought about companies and things as you're working every day. I think it's fun to hear, because we don't in Utah see many people that have worked in the SEC as long as you have. Just kind of what's the mindset when a lawyer goes to work every day at the SEC? What are they thinking about and doing?
It's a great question. And I totally agree with you that you should avoid being sued by the SEC or any kind of SEC enforcement action. That's not a good scene. So that aside, going into work every day in the Small Business Policy Office, you have a ton of different jobs. It's truly a you wear many hats type of role. And all of those roles really involve private company capital raising and giving private companies paths forward to raise capital in an exempt offering. I think one of the biggest kinds of exemptions that the small business policy folks are dealing with right now is Regulation A, which I think is fairly underused by life sciences and biotech companies. But that's an area that's getting a lot of press and something that they spend a lot of time thinking about. Is there a way that we can make that exemption more palatable to companies? Is there a way that we can make investors more interested in putting larger dollar amounts into those offerings? What are the hangups? What are the roadblocks? How can we entice more people and more companies to use Regulation A and to invest in those offerings in meaningful amounts of capital for companies like life sciences companies that need huge amounts of capital to really get their operations off the ground? I think they also answer questions about Reg D offerings. I'm sure some of you have seen Rule 506B offerings in particular. You file a Form D. It's a pretty easy form, not a lot of update requirements, very simple disclosure. But that doesn't mean the offering itself is simple. So answering those phone questions from people that run into issues about how do they know if their investors are accredited, or did they accidentally generally solicit? All of these things are big real-life questions that those attorneys are working every day to help companies answer. And so they are definitely open to talking. They want to help companies succeed. And I think that that is through and through, from all levels of CorpFin, which is the division of the SEC that I worked in, not the scary enforcement folks. They want companies to succeed, and they want companies to be able to raise capital, but they also want to protect investors. That's two of the SEC's 3 parts of their mission. So providing that information, giving material disclosure to investors, but also enabling companies to raise capital. And that's what they're there for.
Great. Well, let's get into talking about some of the ways the SEC wants to help companies raise money. Help.
Yeah, we're having some.
There you go.
There we go. All right. So first slide is on the Securities Act framework. I'm not going to spend a whole huge amount of time on this. We've sort of touched on it already. Investors need to receive information about an offering, be that in an IPO registration statement, a full-blown S1 you're going to list on NASDAQ, or in one of these other kinds of offerings that we've talked about today. I think a Reg A offering has something called a Form 1A. We call it a mini IPO, and it's similar disclosure to that big IPO S1, but not as in-depth. And every offer and sale of securities has to be either registered or exempt. So these two ideas sort of tie together. Whatever you're doing, you need to provide material information to investors so they can make an investment decision, and all of your offerings either need to be registered, that big IPO S1, or they need to be exempt. All right, here we go. Again, another slide we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but this will be a great resource later on. This lays out all of the...
I was just going to ask Scott, the boss, can we share our slides later with people if we want to? Okay, because this one will be a good one to refer to, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's about all there is to say. It's a reference for later. It lays out all of the different kinds of exemptions, all the things you have to do to comply, all of the pros and cons of each, because they're each sort of a balancing act as to what's most appropriate for your company.
That's a great table that kind of lays out the ins and outs of the various ways people do things and can do things. We'll touch more on each of these. So this is a great slide. This is the one to hang on to in my view, but go ahead. Let's go to the next one.
All right. We've been talking a little bit about how private company capital raising is so important to this SEC. And you can see that its IPOs here are 28 billion. I can't actually read that from here, which is a pretty big number. But these amount of especially 506B offerings is larger, right? So there's a huge amount of capital in the private markets. How do we help companies capture that? And how we have different kinds of companies capture that, I think is a question that the SEC and all of us really wrestle with.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that over, you think of IPOs in my history where IPOs and public companies and public offerings were such a big deal, and now so much more is done on the private side. So that's why private is such a big emphasis, but let's keep going.
All right. I'm going to just kind of skip over this one a little bit. So Section 482 is sort of like our umbrella of all of these, some of these exempt offerings. Sort of what we fall back on if we can't really find another good exemption. But if you're setting out to do a transaction and you're starting to raise capital for the first time, this is probably not where you would start, although it is the most utilized securities offering exemption because it's sort of this big catch-all. And it's essentially just for offerings that are not a private offering. So you're selling securities to someone who has information about your company and has access to information and is going to get restricted securities, which means that they can't immediately be resold. There's no secondary market for these. And it's kind of the path forward when you... All right. More technological difficulties.
Oh, the arrows.
Yes.
Ah, got it. Okay.
Exactly. Now that we've solved that problem, and I've lost my train of thought. 482. It's an unlimited offering cap exemption. Number of investors is unlimited. These are sophisticated investors who can fend for themselves, and there are no filing requirements for the SEC.
Just quickly, this is kind of the backstop that we use, but as attorneys, we try to find something more definitive, a safe harbor that we're going to talk about now, where we know if we check the boxes, we're going to be in a safe spot. We fall back to 482, and so let's talk now about 506 and some of the others.
All right. So Sam just mentioned safe harbors under 506, and that's exactly where we're going to go next. There are two prongs of Rule 506, 506B, 506C. 506B is the one that I'm assuming most of you have heard about. Some of you may even have been involved in 506B offerings, and it is far more frequently used than 506C. There are some rules, some trade-offs, again, between 506B and 506C. For 506B and 506C, there's no dollar limit on the transaction. You can raise an unlimited amount of capital. In 506C offerings, you are permitted to generally solicit, which means that you can go out and talk to folks and say, hey, come invest in my company. We're really great. We make the best widgets. In a 506B offering, you cannot do that. 506C offerings are limited to only accredited investors. And that's a really tough thing for some companies, because accredited investors are high net worth individuals, they're VC funds, they're private equity firms, they're family offices, they're broker-dealers who've passed specific licensing exams. Not everybody knows those people. Not everybody has, a rich friend who they can call up and say, hey, I need some money for my business. That's why 506C offerings can be hard. The other requirement for 506C is that not only do your investors have to be accredited, but you have to take reasonable steps to verify their accredited status prior to allowing them to buy securities. So you can't go back later and check to see, hey, were they accredited? You have to follow some specific procedures set out in the statute to do so before offering and selling them securities.
And I don't know if anybody's done a lot of offerings. I don't know if anybody, I'd love to know if someone in the room has ever actually seen a 506C offering happen. Oh?
All right.
Yeah. One on purpose and one not on purpose. The one not on purpose, they engaged in enough activities that they had to,
They started generally soliciting. They didn't really want to, but they did.
It was inadvertent, they didn't realize it, and so that's between the choice of sort of standing down and starting again months later, late 506. The one that did it on purpose thought, oh, this is neat, but it was a cool investment fund. The limited partners who invested in those are really rich.
Yes.
I'm used to people asking them to document their accredited investor status.
Yes.
They were highly annoyed at that, and so it was a one and done. They said, oh, we're going to do this, and then because you have to go to a third party advisor or somebody to say, yeah, they really are good for it, and
Yeah. Well, I'm interested enough, and you raised your hand. Thank you for doing that. Is there anything particularly interesting about the one you've? Oh, okay. Well, similar facts to that. Okay.
I'm curious, I have a follow-up question. Did they just get lucky with all accredited investors?
On the first
On
one.
the first one, the inadvertent one?
Yeah, that's all that they ever really engaged with. They
Okay.
just done enough activities that it just couldn't do B. There was enough kind of out there. So they were only talking with the usual suspects. So it was an all-accredited offering, but they're not even. That one went down easier, small number of investors, different crowd, high net worth angels. You know, they were different, like the partners are going to be with full funds. So yeah, they reacted to the follow-up and prove it, you know, if you're accredited.
Well, that 506B is what emerging companies, which a lot of life science companies are, the ones that are growing, starting, all that, 90-something% of the time they rely on 506B. That's what their lawyers will tell them to do. That's what they'll try to do. And they'll try to do it with only accredited investors if they can, so they don't have to do added and complicated disclosure requirements, right? That's what you can do too. Sometimes we'll do that. Sometimes we'll have companies take that on, but for the most part, they avoid having non-accredited investors, so they don't have to do that disclosure requirement, and that's what we do. And any kind of traditional venture capital financing, any institutional equity financing, almost all of those are that way. Probably everybody who's seen a company raise money has seen a 506B offering. Anything else you'd add about the 506B?
No, I think that sums it up.
But that's not always the best one, and sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes those accredited investors or institutions don't want to invest in you. So you got to figure something else out. But let's keep going.
Yeah, so I think we've sort of covered 506C. I don't think we need to say any more. We rarely ever see it. Demo days kind of relates to the same thing. It talks about this idea of when are you generally soliciting, when are you not. Another 506C concept. And if you are interested in 506C offerings, over the summer, the SEC came out with some new guidance about when you can consider investors to be accredited. For folks who do these offerings all the time, it was sort of interesting news, and the SEC went ahead and documented it in some formal guidance. But for those who don't see this all the time, I think it's just something to remember. It's there if you come across it, but probably not earth-shaking to your daily routine. Just a little chart about Reg D offerings and what is happening with them. You can see the increasing dollar value, but the decreasing deal numbers. So obviously, smaller numbers of larger amounts of capital being raised in these deals. So just an interesting commentary on where the market is going and where the market has been. You can see some pretty dramatic spikes in it over the past 2 years, or past 2023 in particular.
I think it'll be fun to talk about Reg A and see if that's, because you said at the outside that maybe a lot of life science companies haven't really embraced Reg A, but it might be something they should or start considering. And so let's take a few minutes and talk about Reg A and see where it can take us.
I think Reg A is a pretty interesting alternative for life science companies. I think the two kind of tiers that have really raised a lot of capital and been very successful in Reg A have been real estate companies and banks. But I don't know exactly why, and maybe you guys know more than I do on this, as to why life sciences companies haven't really taken advantage of Reg A to the extent that I think it's possible. You can raise a pretty large amount of capital under Reg A. In a Tier 2 offering, you can raise up to $75 million in any 12-month period, so that's a pretty substantial amount of money. You can raise it from all different kinds of investors. There is a cap on the amount of money that any non-accredited investor can invest in a Tier 2 offering, but again, it's fairly high. There's no intermediary required. An intermediary is a concept we'll talk about later, but it's essentially WeFunder or one of these pages that's online that you can go to and scroll through and see all of the Reg A and the Reg crowdfunding offerings. Reg crowdfunding requires you to work with one of those. Reg A does not, although some folks opt to do so because it does put your offering out there and kind of gives you some publicity and puts it on people's radar in a way that you might not be able to on your own. It has this really interesting concept of testing the waters, which means that if you want to do a Reg A offering, before you file anything with the SEC and go through the expense of preparing your disclosure and your financials, you can actually go out and see if people would be interested in investing in your offering. You can't actually offer and sell securities, you can't take any money from them, you can't promise to take money from them, but you can go out and see if they might be interested if you went ahead with this offering. And that's a really good way to test the waters, right? Dip your toe in, see if folks are interested, and if you went ahead with this process, would they actually be willing to invest in your company? Would your offering be successful? So that's a really big benefit of a Reg A offering, especially for a company that might be trying to get its name out there and trying to kind of generate some buzz about both their product and their investment. Technology is not my friend today. To do a Reg A offering, you need to file what's called a Form 1A, or colloquially a mini IPO, with the SEC. It's a disclosure form. It has information about your business, your risk factors, your officers and directors. You do need to include financial statements. Depending on the amount of money you're going to raise, they may or may not need to be audited. They need to be included. And that goes through a review process with the SEC. And they can ask comments, they can ask questions, you can have to come back with comments, you can amend your filing to respond to those comments or for any other material changes while you're going through this process. At the end of the process, the SEC does what's called qualifying your 1A, and you can go ahead and offer and sell securities. So you can go back out to all those folks who you tested the waters with and say, hey, you remember me? I'm back, and I have this offering statement, and I'm ready to offer and sell you securities in my company. Another great benefit of Reg A is that these are not restricted securities, which means that your shareholders can buy and sell their securities on the secondary market. So they're not locked up, and they can continue to resell if they need the capital or you're just not aligned with the company anymore.
Well, why don't people do more of these? And maybe folks in the audience can comment. What is scary about a Reg A offering that keeps a lot of companies from doing it? Because not a lot do, right? It's not happening as much as the SEC would like. We can comment, but does anybody have any thoughts? Has anybody ever considered a Reg A offering and not done one in the audience by chance? You haven't even thought about it? It's interesting.
Did you know about Reg A offerings and just decide not to do them? Or is this kind of like, hey, this is news that this option is out there?
Go ahead, Neela.
Client that was actually considering Reg A and 506C for solicitation purposes and advertising purposes. They wanted to take a very bespoke, custom way of approaching certain individuals, and the offering limit was the amount was the limit for them. To go above and beyond the 20 to 75.
It's interesting, and I think that's one of the ideas that comes up when the SEC and when other stakeholders talk about Reg A, is the amount too low for it really to be a feasible alternative for companies, especially life sciences companies, right, where the capital needs are huge for some of these companies to develop a drug or get a product off the ground. And so that is certainly an idea that's kicked around. I think some people are concerned about the disclosure requirements. Is it too much disclosure? Are you asking the company to do too much at too early a stage in their life cycle? There's update requirements that are required with a Reg A offering. There's ongoing disclosure, which you don't have in a Reg D offering. You have to file your Form D, and if your offering is still ongoing after a year, you have to do an annual amendment. And it's a one-pager. This Form 1A is not a one-pager. So that's something that we've heard about being a potential.
The only other things I'd add is certainly I'm familiar with some Reg A transactions, mostly in the film industry, and at least the ones I've seen, a company will wake up after doing a Reg A offering and have 5,000 new shareholders on their cap table, which is a lot, right? And most traditionally funded companies who might be seeking institutional money and all that, those folks aren't used to seeing cap tables with 5,000 people on them. Neela's nodding. That's an issue, but I don't know if it should be an insurmountable issue. We've seen companies deal with it, and you can wiggle around it if you just think a little bit. And the other thing is, even though those shares are not restricted when you get them, where does the market come where people could actually sell their shares? And nothing really exists that works right now. But it's still a really interesting idea for companies that are maybe pretty established but disenchanted with traditional avenues of raising money or not being liked by VCs or whatever. I think people should look at it a little bit more. But anyway, let's move on.
I agree with that. Moving on to reg crowdfunding, which is another one of these newer and not utilized in the way the SEC thought or hoped it would be exemptions. The offering cap on this is pretty low. It's $5 million in a 12-month period. So that's probably for a life science company, that's a little bit lower than capital needs would be. That said, it's very easy to do. You file a Form C with the SEC, which is, again, a disclosure document that has some information about the company and your directors and officers, kind of all of your usual disclosure suspects, financial statements. But it's a pretty easy lift in terms of doing it or having your attorney do it. The disclosure is not too invasive, and it is not reviewed by the SEC, which means that you can just file and go. You are required to use an intermediary, such as WeFunder or a different platform, to do a Reg CF offering. So when you go online into one of those and you see kind of, invest in whatever, the coffee shop around the corner or someone's next great widget idea, those are Reg CF offerings generally that you can invest in online.
Again, has anybody ever seen a Reg CF offering out here? No. Again, I've seen them in the film industry, but that's the only place I've seen them so far. Yes, sir.
Very basic question. So can you sell, share ownership of the company through the crowdfunding mechanism? I've only ever seen it where you get it.
You're thinking of like Kickstarter or whatever, right? And
it's a little different.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a little different than that, where you actually are selling shares, you're selling securities, not like, a free dog wash or, a dinner at my restaurant or whatever it is that.
Those are efforts to raise money, but you're not selling stock in the company. And this is selling actual shares in the company, and they're on your cap table, and you have fiduciary duties to them, and you have to think about all that stuff, but it still can work. Thanks for asking a question. We appreciate that.
Definitely. So I talked a little bit earlier about how the SEC is very interested in small business capital raising. They actually have a committee called the Small Business Capital Formation Advisory Committee, which is a heck of a mouthful. It's an advisory committee, right? Nothing they do is binding. They can't make rules or give actual agency guidance. But quite often what they are talking about are hot button issues that the SEC and the commissioners are very interested in, and they want to hear. The committee is made up of entrepreneurs and attorneys and accountants and investors and kind of folks who are just living in this market and in this community and are bringing their real life experience and their practical knowledge to the committee to share. And the commissioners can listen and kind of learn how these things are working or not working in the real world. Reg A is something that's gotten a ton of attention this summer. This idea about finders has gotten attention. The new SEC chairman, Paul Atkins, has talked about private company capital raising. It's definitely something that is on their agenda, literally and figuratively, because the SEC did release a new rulemaking agenda, I think in August. And they talked about revising, updating the exempt offering pathway, which is what we are talking about today. And the potential for rule amendments to facilitate capital formation or to create new pathways for raising capital and to provide investor access to private business. And these are these ideas like, do we raise the Reg A Tier 2 threshold? Will that help companies actually raise capital? Or do we need to do something else? Because the majority of Reg A offerings are actually far below that threshold. They seek to raise $75 million and then they'll raise 20. and what causes that discrepancy? Why are investors not interested in raising that full amount, and how can we overcome that barrier to help these companies be successful and have access to the capital that is certainly out there?
Well, now we're going to talk a little bit about how you figure out where you should go in terms of, and what's best for you in terms of raising capital. First off, like in the room, if you don't mind raising your hand, who's been involved in companies that have raised money? Who's worked in that? Who's helped your company raise money before? Got a few of you at least? Yeah. Let's talk about kind of what you think about when you do that. And what do you think about there? What types of investors do you want to have? Or is it simply a matter of where can I get the most money fastest? Or what else do you think about when you're out raising money? And I see you smiling. Any thoughts when you've done it? What have you thought about when you've gone out to raise?
Truthfully, I'm fairly new at the exercise. It's been a year and a half, but have gone to VCs, have gone to house accounts, have gone to physician surgeons, and going about different ways of raising money. And what it comes down to me is like, how much are we giving away? How much control are we giving away? And what's the value for the money?
Yeah.
And that's really the big question mark for us.
You've found one of the biggest question marks, of course, is that balancing act of getting enough money to stay alive, but what do your investors pay something to give you money. They give you money. They give you cash, but you pay something too. You pay in stock. You pay in a chunk of your company. A percentage of the pie is going out. And how much are you willing to give? And one of the fun balancing acts in all of the equity raising world is raising enough money that you don't get squeezed and really struggle, but not raising too much at too low a valuation where you give up too much of the company. And what's the right answer in all that? It's hard to know. But having worked with companies that do this over 28, 29 years, it's better to err on the side of raising a little more money than running out. I've seen companies do that a lot more than say, darn, I raised too much money at too low a valuation. It can happen. Maybe Matt's seen it a few times because he's done a lot of financings. But do you agree with that, Matt? Do you agree? Okay, yeah. Matt's one of our partners who's done a lot of this stuff. But when you think about, okay, what am I going to do? You have to think about that question. How much am I going to raise, and how much am I going to give up? Who are my potential investors going to be? Who do I want to have on my cap table? When I have to go think about what I need to do next, or if I'm going to have a shareholders meeting, or I'm going to have a board meeting, who do I want there? And if it's a traditional, like institutional venture capital kind of world that you're going to go into, that's great and wonderful. Their money's fantastic, and they know a lot of stuff, and they can bring a lot of value, but you're also taking on, they're going to want board seats, they're going to want blocking rights, they're going to want all sorts of things that have probably been discussed earlier today. So you have to take that into account. And I see companies in desperate efforts to seek VC funding, and others try to avoid venture capital funds with all their might because they don't want that burden and pain and challenge that comes sometimes in their view. So you have to really kind of figure out for you and your product and your company what makes the most sense. If you're doing a regular, let's switch the slides. If you're doing a regular offering, a 506B, you're not typically going to use an intermediary. That means somebody who's going to facilitate the offering for you. If you're like, traditional stuff isn't going to work, we've got to figure out general solicitation, we've got to go out and find investors, that it's maybe a really good idea to consider using an intermediary. Sometimes too, besides a formal intermediary would actually help make the transaction happen. Sometimes you might use a financial advisor that could that you'd pay money to help you raise money, and we won't go much into that. That's a different version of an intermediary, but sometimes we see people do that too. And do you want to do general solicitation? Some companies like that. Some companies want to do that for various reasons, right? They want to get their name out. They want to tell the world we're trying to raise money. And again, I've seen that in the film industry or other like niche consumer products areas or whatever. We're like, we want you to know about who we are. We want to raise money. We want to go to, we want a big cap table. We want thousands of people on the cap table. Let's go. That's a real thing that some people do. And I wonder for some life science products whether that's not the worst idea. It's not always the best, but maybe it's not always the worst.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Has anyone in this room ever been in that experience where you're really trying to generally solicit and raise kind of awareness of your product and buy some kind of investment in it in multiple ways, money and also like goodwill? Interesting
Thought to think about. Disclosure is a big thing. And with Liz here, who's worked at the SEC, I'm going to ask her to comment a little bit about this. One of the reasons people like to do those 506B offerings with only accredited investors, as I mentioned before, the formal disclosure obligation out of all these potential exemptions that are available, I think it's the least, right? That's the least amount of disclosure you technically have to deliver. That doesn't mean you don't need to provide good information to people. And maybe, Liz, you could comment briefly on that. I think it'd be worthwhile. But you do need to take into account, like, it's going to cost money to put together disclosure. You probably want a lawyer involved to help you do that. How am I going to pay for the lawyer? What's going to go on there? That's another factor in all this. And that's one of the reasons that 506B, if you can pull it off, kind of, again, 9 times out of 10 is what people do. But I want to pause and ask you, Liz, from your perspective, with your history I think sometimes people don't think enough about what they still should disclose in a 506B offering. So maybe you could comment on that for a minute, and then I could maybe share a quick story about an experience I had in this regard. But let's start with that. If you are lucky enough, okay, we got an investor group, we've not general solicited, we think they're all accredited, what information do I need to give them to do a good 506B offering?
It's a great question, and I think I'm going to give a very classic lawyer answer here. That's a facts and circumstances decision. Where your company is in its life cycle, what kind of company it is, these are all things that are going to determine what disclosure is good disclosure, right? If you're a pre-revenue company and you've just started and you're doing research into a potential new drug, the information you have about your company is going to be so different than maybe you're on a stage 2 clinical trial and you're still pre-revenue, but you have financial statements, you have done previous financing rounds, you have maybe taken on some debt or some other equity partners before this round. Your financials and your cap table are going to look extraordinarily different. And the depth of information you have is going to be very different, right? You have either an idea, maybe some research behind it, maybe some testing, or you have, a stage 1 clinical trial and you've been talking with the FDA and you have some idea about whether or not this works. And the amount of information you need to disclose is going to be proportionate to where you are in your business. And I think it also depends on what kind of investor you're talking to, right? Is it a wealthy, high net worth individual who has a personal stake in you figuring out this drug, for example? Or is it a VC who always invests in these kind of drug pathways and they are very educated and they need to know all of the specific science and whatever else behind what you are doing, versus someone who you can go to and say, hey, I think this is a good idea. This is how it works. Here's some information. Ask me questions, versus you being able to go out with a kind of whole disclosure packet and a private placement memorandum, which you should have in either case, and give that information to a VC and be able to have a very educated back and forth about it.
My comment, and maybe some of the lawyers in the room would see if they agree with me, but when I think about this, and I talk to companies, I kind of ask them, well, if you were one of these investors, what do you not want to tell them? What do you want to hide from them?
What are your skeletons in the
What
closet?
do you not want to tell them? Because I've heard many times people come to me and say, well, I don't want to tell them that. The message back is, those things that you don't want to tell them, those are exactly the things you have to tell them. Those things you most don't want to tell them are the things you get to tell them. That's kind of providing the information, the general scope of detail that if you were an investor, you'd want to know, and you want them to know. And so that's what you need to think about, even in a 506B offering, and even when you're dealing with very sophisticated people. Now, this is an interesting question. It is case by case, because sometimes if you've raised money with 3 investors and you're going to do it again a year later, and it's the same 3, the amount of information, and they've been involved and aware of the business, what you provide them is very different maybe from what you provide to 3 brand new investors you've never talked to before, that you've met but you've never talked to before, and they haven't invested. So you have to kind of think through that. And some 506B deals will advise our clients, hey, you need to put a pretty good package together, and you need to draft risk factors, and let's go, let's get them that. And others, you don't have to do that because of the nature and circumstances. So I just want to make sure people are thinking about that. My quick story, I know time's close to up, but it's worth mentioning, because I had a client who I advised in this very issue, this very question, hey, that's pretty important. I think I'd want to know that if I was an investor. You should disclose that. And it turns out they said, okay, we'll disclose it. And they put it in their little executive summary that they sent to investors. But it turns out they went and sort of did the opposite thing that they said they'd do in that disclosure. And they never updated their disclosure. And then things went sour. Somebody complained to the state. It's a lot of times it happens that way. The state has its own division of securities, like Utah does in other states. They complain there. Something happens. They maybe talk to the SEC. The next thing you know, this client got a call from the SEC and an investigation occurs. First thing that happens when an investigation occurs is the SEC says, okay, well, Sam, you're the lawyer for these guys. First thing I'm going to do is ask them to waive any privilege they have with you on any of your communications. And it's kind of just say yes to that, because if you say no, then it just stuff gets worse. So they say yes, and so suddenly then what happens is all my advice to them comes out in the wash of me telling them, you have to disclose this, you have to do that, you have to do all this stuff. And I end up getting deposed. I have to say, and they sit and ask me, I become the SEC's star witness, where they're like, you told them to do this, right? Yeah, I told them to do that. You told them to do this, right? You told them to say that. And then it turns out they didn't do that. And then they got in trouble, and it wasn't pretty. So this disclosure stuff's super important. It's not that hard if you think about it and plan for it and do it right. But one thing people do, especially when companies are struggling to raise money, it's one thing to like, hey, I'm going to gather 6 investors and we're going to do a financing and we're going to close on June 28th, and that's our closing date, and that's it. And that's the date my disclosure needs to be really good. And there's other companies who start raising money on June 1st and they keep raising kind of on the same round for 6 months or longer. But they fail to update their disclosure during the time period that goes by. And that's one of the things this client of mine didn't do, is they didn't update their disclosure. So be careful of that. Be careful about how long and open your money raising period is. You got to think about when you're going to close, and be careful about, oh, if I'm going to close, let's make sure I've gotten good disclosure to everybody when I get to this particular closing date, because I've seen that get messed up. Any comments or questions about any of that from the group? Do you have anything more to add to that?
Just that the idea of updating your disclosure is incredibly important. I think it's something that is often an oversight.
It
and
is.
a material omission is securities fraud. So it's something that the SEC and your state securities regulators take extremely seriously. And so it is important before every closing to make sure that your disclosure is still materially complete and accurate. Otherwise, those enforcement guys are going to show up at your door.
We're lucky in our firm at Mayor Brown to have experts like Liz in our firm and here with us. In Utah, we don't always have people who've spent multiple years in the SEC. Any questions any of you would have for someone like with her experience? Is there anything else out there that you'd like to talk about? This is a good, yeah, Neela.
You talked about how the SEC wants more private capital raising, and then I sometimes hear from the global capital markets team that, they also want to see more public raising, and you showed us kind of the vast difference in the amount of capital that's raised privately versus publicly. I'm just curious if in the SEC there's kind of this competitive, friendly or not friendly division of, no, we want you to raise publicly, no, we want you to raise privately. I'm just curious to hear your perspective on that.
Good question, because you do kind of hear these sort of competing messages. But I don't think they're necessarily competitive because it depends where your company is in the life cycle, right? If you've just started out and you just are starting your company, you're not going to do an IPO. It's not feasible for 1,000 reasons. You don't have financial statements. You don't have a business. You can't afford the lawyers and the accountants to put together your disclosure and to go through the SEC review process. But you can raise money on the private markets. And the SEC wants to encourage companies to be able to raise money and to grow and to take advantage of that private capital raising so that they can go ahead and do an IPO when they are a big enough, large enough company to support it and to have their shares traded publicly on an exchange.
Liz, one of the things we'll do is let people out a little bit early, but we have a few slides, and if you want, we'll get you our slide deck. But what's kind of following up to Neela's question, what do you see happening, or what's going on at the SEC when you, in light of the fact that there's been less public offering and IPO activity over the last several years compared to years way back, what do you see going on later stage financings and that sort of thing, and how the SEC's, or what's just generally happening with later stage companies that might otherwise 20 years ago would have said, hey, I'm an IPO candidate, I'm going to go public, when now today they don't necessarily do it. Just quick comments on that to wind up for today.
There's a much larger number of later stage private financings, huge number of Series D, Series E, and they're on rounds of financing that would not have happened, 20 years, even 10 years ago. Companies continue to get good valuations in the private markets. They have investors they know. They kind of know the deal they're getting into, right? Versus an IPO where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of wiggle room, and you're very tied to the market volatility. And right now we're seeing a lot of market volatility and not a lot of IPOs, versus in the private market where everyone is pretty much on the same page, and you have VCs who may already have seats on the board and who are already part of your company for all intents and purposes, and you're just giving them a larger piece of the pie. So I think that that's an area that is really booming these days. I think the SEC would probably like to change that a little bit. I think one thing that we're going to see in this new administration is an emphasis on disclosure, specifically some about private company disclosure, like you talked about today, but especially public company disclosure. And I think that the direction they are going to go is more principles-based disclosure that is meant to serve investors, not to serve other social groups. Like, I think the climate rulemaking that recently sort of blew up for the SEC is a good example of that, right? In the previous administration, the SEC adopted some incredibly detailed climate-based disclosure rules. They immediately were subject to litigation, and then this summer, the commission said that they were not going to defend those rules anymore. So they're sort of in limbo right now, but they're not going to move forward under this administration. Instead, they're going to focus on probably simplifying public company disclosure. I think executive comp might be an area where we see a lot less disclosure. But
honestly, if you read a 10K or a proxy statement that has that stuff in it, it's basically impossible to read and make any sense of anyway, so.
I agree, and I do that for a living.
Okay, keep going, sorry, we're finishing up, but last comments on that. You done? Yeah,
done.
and
I just have one question, in that, companies are staying public or private longer or forever. And so from the kind of companies that we work with, a lot of the kinds of companies that are raising money, growing, the traditional trajectory was you raise money, and then you have a liquidity event. And there was kind of an understood time period for that. Options last for 10 years, but
Yeah.
forever, we'll have the thing sold or public by then. That's not as true anymore, and so a lot of these later stage rounds, or sometimes it's just purely the secondary round, there's just desperation, liquidity, absent the public offering. And on that side of the house, usually when we structure them, it's a growth equity round, and, it's credit to credit, and we're using the 4.1.5, which I know is mapped out by it, so I'm sorry, but anyway, everybody's accredited, we know how that works. Sometimes there are redemptions of people who own options, but do you think the commission's going to focus on liberalizing that side of it that they have on the primary capital side, but there's so much demand, and that puts a pressure under people running companies where they take venture capital on the kind of old paradigm, and they're like, we're out 5 years, it's 10 years later, and they got to create some liquidity. So sometimes I think people back into data transactions, that's what they want, because they can't target liquidity in the secondary market, private secondary market.
I think that's true. I think that's something Chairman Atkins has actually addressed in the Reg A context. Like, how do we actually create secondary markets for these non-restricted shares? What do we do to, you have the ability to create liquidity, but it's not happening. So what needs to change, or what can we encourage to make those markets actually develop? And that stands true for any sort of restricted securities that were issued and are no longer restricted, or whatever the context is. And I think, we saw direct listings a couple of years ago. We haven't really seen any more of those since. But people get creative when they need to. So we'll see what happens.
well, our time's up. If there's any last questions, please come up after. We really appreciate your time and attention. We made it to mile 26. We're still standing. We're not crawling across the finish line. So that's good, I hope. Thank you very, very much.